I think a lot of people, they're looking at the price action of crypto and they're saying there's really not a lot happening right now. And I just think that they're not necessarily looking into the right places, right? I think a lot of people miss or fail to connect what has happened over the last couple of days within this space. There has been a handful of announcements that have seriously confirmed something that essentially has been building for the past couple of years. And these announcements are confirming, it's a confirmation as to where we're going in this space. We are shifting out of speculation into a market that's driven by utility. That's absolutely happening. There's no doubt about it. And the first confirmation is coming out of the UK. All right. This is coming from the FCA. It's a regulator. The FCA is a regulator. And it stands for the Financial Conduct Authority. The FCA stands for the Financial Conduct Authority. All right. And the FCA had approved Ripple to operate under a particular type of permission, a particular type of financial permissioning. And this permissioning is called a EML. All right. An EML stands for Electronic Money Institution. And it allows a firm to issue electronic money and provide digital payment services. Right? And they're allowed to do this under the strict oversight of the UK's financial conduct. Now, to be honest with you, I really wasn't aware of who the FCA was or what the EML was. So I had to look into it a little bit before I decided to jump on with you guys tonight. But essentially, it's a regulator, and this is essentially a filter for what can actually be utilized within the financial system. The second thing that had come out was that banks are expanding their tokenized deposits. All right. We have BNY Mellon. BNY Mellon, right? They're expanding their tokenized deposits with the ambitions to support programmable on-chain cash for institutions and market infrastructures. Tokenized deposits in a very simple manner is essentially the banks are taking the money that people already have inside of the banking system, right? It's your deposits. Every kind of deposit to a bank, whether it's a savings, checking, business, all of those deposits in the bank, that money that's already there. And they're taking that money and they're upgrading how that money moves, how that money is going to be settled, and how they can connect it into the modern financial systems. And then we had the third thing, which was BNY Mellon, which was coming out. They are one of the largest financial institutions in the entire world. And they came out and they said that they're expanding their services for their institutional clients for tokenized deposits. And of course, Ripple Prime is involved. Of course, directly involved in that. So what does this mean? Well, I'm essentially connecting all three of these dots together because even though they are different topics, you start to realize that they aren't necessarily three separate things, right? When we pay attention to the Ripple obtaining the licensing, when we pay attention to banks expanding their tokenized deposits, as well as Ripple Prime's integration with BNY's tokenized deposits, you realize that they're really not separate things. Of course, one, you have the approval coming from the UK. The second thing is how the banks are actually upgrading their rails and the money that moves on it. And then the third thing is this institutional expansion. So when you slow down and you look at them all together, they're all really kind of telling a similar story, right? They're telling you how the financial system is now figuring out how this digital technology can be integrated into traditional finance. They're trying to figure out who is allowed to operate inside of the system. And that's the biggest filter of them all. I don't know why we're going to invest into blockchain that cannot operate inside of the financial system. That makes no sense to me. Does that make sense to you? It doesn't make any sense to me. How do you do that? But this is what we're trying to figure out as educated investors. The institutions, I believe that they're also trying to figure out who is allowed to operate inside of the system. And they're also trying to figure out which rails are going to carry the money. What rails are going to carry the money? That's what we're paying attention to. So this entire story, when you piece all three of those, it's about how our financial system is being completely upgraded from the ground up. The change from speculation into utility. And to be honest, people feel like nothing is going to happen in crypto this year, or they feel like nothing is happening because I believe that they're looking at the wrong things, right? They're looking for these fireworks of what's going on in crypto. They're looking for the influencers to get behind the screen and tell you the price is going to go up. It's going to go up tomorrow. Just wait. It's coming. It's coming. $1 million. It's coming. They're looking for that short-term price action. They are selling you on that cheap dopamine. And I think that, you know, to be honest, it's not just the content creators' faults, but sometimes it's the viewers' faults as well. Because we want to, you know, when price is boring, we want somebody to tell us that it's going to be okay. But the biggest change to the financial system, they always happen quietly. And they never do it in the public eye. The way that they do it is they do it through regulation. They do it through certain alleys of permission. They do it through infrastructure upgrades. And necessarily, that doesn't really catch retail's attention. It doesn't even catch retail's interests because it's boring. Think of how the internet changed, right? It didn't start right away with social media, but it started with protocols. It started with cables. It started with standards. Retail was completely oblivious to that. But nobody wants to talk about that. And by the time that people realize the internet is becoming real, it was too late. And that's exactly what this moment is feeling like. So the approval from Ripple, right, for getting the FCA, this isn't necessarily about Ripple, the company, being rewarded or celebrated, but it's about the UK saying, okay, this type of technology fits inside of our financial system. And that is a huge signal to me and many other investors that digital payment rails can legally be integrated and operating inside of the same financial systems that banks are working along, the same one that financial market infrastructures are working along with. Add on top of that, the tokenized deposits are growing rapidly, right? I had made a video maybe in the summer, the differences between stablecoins and tokenized deposits. But tokenized deposits are ramping up, right? And there's particular technological reasoning behind it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that stablecoins are going away, right? They all have their positioning and they have their reasons for being in here. But tokenized deposits are very similar to CBDCs and stablecoins. Of course, it's the issuer that is different, right? But it's all programmable money. And the banks are trying to fix problems that they've had for years. They've had these problems for years. The settlement is insanely slow. There's trapped idle money, trillions of dollars that never moves. That idle money, the banks are losing out on interest or loaning out. That money's stuck there. And it creates a massive inefficiency in our financial system. And on top of that, you have BNY Mellon expanding their tokenized deposit services. And they are essentially giving into the institutional needs, right? It was the institutions that essentially wanted the tokenized deposits. And when an institution like BNY Mellon expands on something like that, it's because the system is preparing for what is coming next. That is, you know how important this is that BNY Mellon is getting ahead of the game on this? You add on top of that Ripple Prime, right? Being involved, being directly involved, because it's showing where Ripple is positioning itself inside of it, right? Ripple, it's infrastructure at this point. It's sitting inside of that institutional workflows. And try to guess what asset revolves around that. So this is the part that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with. Not every asset is going to function inside of the new financial system. I don't know how else to tell you. I'm not going to lie to you. Not every asset is going to meet with the standards, with the compliance. They're just not. We are witnessing this old system being, they're not even tearing it down. They're essentially upgrading it piece by piece, but they're doing it in a controlled, permissioned manner. And they're doing this under very strict oversight from governments and regulators. So whether it's digital assets and blockchains, all of these rails are being absorbed into the traditional financial system because they solve a problem. They solve a real problem that the banks and the regulators actually care about. And I want you guys to care about it as well. If the institutions care about it, if this is what they're looking at, then we need to be looking at it. Because we can't just pay attention to retail liquidity. Retail liquidity is a drop in the bucket to institutional liquidity. Watch what the banks are doing. The banks never lose. So why would you not try to follow what the banks are doing? So I want you to understand what happened, why all of this matters, and why the people who ignore moments like this are usually the ones that don't realize what happened until it's already done. So I guess we could dive a little bit deeper into it. To be honest with you, I really can't even keep up with the news that's coming out. I can't. But it's almost undeniable. Like, if you are shitting on Ripple or XRP at this point, I don't know what the fuck you're looking at. We're obviously not looking at the same things. Or maybe you just don't understand what you're reading, or you don't think that it's relevant. But the news keeps coming out week after week, revolving around this company. So this is something really to pay attention to. You have to pay attention to this and try to unravel what is being said at the headlines. We have to look into the weeds of it and figure out how these assets are actually functioning within the systems that they're supposed to operate into. So when we hear about something like Ripple getting the approval from the FCA, it's not a headline. It's not a headline. It's going to be a filter. This is what's going to filter out a majority of what can actually function within our traditional financial system. Okay? You can't sit there and say Ripple paid for this, or somebody there really likes Ripple, because that couldn't be any further from the truth. So, from my understanding, the FCA is a regulator, and their entire job is to make sure that money moves safely, legally, and in a way that does not threaten or risk the entire financial system. They're not going to implement something that you could just pay to get into the club. So when the FCA does something, it has done it under an intense microscope to ensure that it's not going to threaten our financial system. And they do this in probably one of the largest extents. They overanalyze into this because the consequences of not looking into this financial software properly is global destruction. So regulations and compliance matters a lot. Can this technology actually survive inside of the financial system? If it can't, why the fuck are you investing into it long term? You know, you want to make your short-term gains? Okay, fine. But if it can't survive 10, 15 years, what the fuck are you thinking? What are you thinking? It's like buying a penny stock with knowing that it'll never go on to the fucking the S&P 500. Well, what are we doing here? So what the UK did here is extremely important, not just for the UK, but for all crypto. What they did was they took digital asset and different types of payment technologies, and they embedded them directly inside of the existing financial laws and infrastructures. And it's crypto assets is what they did. The UK basically said, we're going to treat this technology, crypto and blockchain, the same way that we treat payments, money services, and all different types of financial infrastructures. So that means that these digital assets, they don't get a free pass. They don't. They are held to the largest scrutiny as they would a bank, as they would a financial market infrastructure. They have to meet the same requirements as any other company that moves money. And unfortunately, a lot of assets cannot meet this standard. So they will be forced to operate, if they even can operate, outside of the system. So Ripple receiving this approval, it matters a lot. It's another filter. We'll put it that way. It's another filter. It's another very long checklist that they had to get passed by. So the electronic money license, right? It's permission to essentially. It's permission. It essentially just says that you're allowed to operate inside of the money system. That's essentially what it is. So This is the same category of permission that's used by companies that process payments. They can have digital wallets. They can issue money. They move funds between people and banks and infrastructures. Right? Anyone that's essentially in the financial market has to maintain this type of license. So when Ripple receives this approval, it was literally the UK saying, okay, this technology can function inside of our system. That's big. That's fucking big. I don't know. Are we not paying attention to the institutional onboarding? So that right there is the difference between a crypto asset being an experiment and a crypto asset being an enabler. If it has this, of course, you know it's going to enable payments. It's going to enable settlement. It's going to enable liquidity. But regulators, they don't enable thoughts. They don't enable ideas. They don't enable use cases because it sounds cool. Because they threw AI, in the white papers. They enable infrastructure, things that actually provide services. And another thing is the regulators, they're not walking around choosing their favorite cryptos, right? They're not picking favorites. They're choosing systems that are stable, systems that are controlled, systems that are compliant enough to be allowed near where the real money, where the real liquidity is going to flow. And when the regulators approve infrastructure, essentially what they're doing is they're giving it permission to institutions to interact with it on that global scale. So the regulators have to move first. They have to look at the technology, analyze it. They have to approve it. And then the banks will come. But without the regulators, you'll never have that institutional adoption, right? So the banks, we can see it in the United States. The banks are on the sidelines. They're waiting for legal clarity. Because if something goes wrong in a banking system, the consequences of that is entire economies get affected. I mean, look at 2008. Look at what happened in 2008 with rehypothecation and over-collateralization. They fucked the economy up. They really did on a global scale. So, yeah, you could look at crypto and it may feel slow, but not what I'm looking at. What the UK did was they opened the door, right? They opened the door for regulated, permissioned, compliant digital infrastructure to operate next to the institutions and to tap into institutional liquidity. Once that door is open, the banks can walk right through it and utilize it without fear that they're doing something wrong. The UK is basically saying this technology can operate inside of the financial system. Long story short, right? But once a country like the UK does that, the other countries are watching it very closely. You better believe the United States is paying attention to. If I'm paying attention to this, you don't think the United States is paying attention to this? Of course they are. Financial systems are interconnected on a global scale, right? Money does not just stop at the UK's borders, right? If one major economy integrates in a technology safely enough, then others are going to study it. Others are going to adopt it. And they're going to probably implement very similar rules, right? When you pay attention to the type of rules that the FCA has to implement in for these crypto asset regulations, this type of rules will probably be copied on a global scale to look at it. And that's exactly how you get global standards, right? You'll have one company do it, one government do it, and others will kind of follow it and mock it. And this moment here alone is far more impressive and important than any short-term price action. Because you know what? You want to know the reality of any type of infrastructure? The price always reacts after the infrastructure is built. Not before it. The infrastructure is built, and then the price will react to that. And once something can operate inside of the law, you better believe it can scale. It's that institutional onboarding. So what happens when by the end of the year XRP is at 30 cents again? Who gives a fuck about the price? Are you okay? Okay. He's worried about short-term price action. Okay, who gives a fuck? Let it go to 10 cents. I don't care. Oh my God, the UK opened a door and it made it legally possible for this technology to operate inside of the financial system. And you're asking what the short-term price action is going to be? You should be asking what type of money can actually move on these rails, right? Because if money is the center of everything, then before crypto, before blockchain, before stablecoins and tokenized deposits, what kind of money do you think that they were moving? Right? Do you think that this is just, they're completely inventing a new form of money? Is that what you think is happening? That's not what's happening. The money itself is being upgraded, right? When we pay attention to stablecoins, nope. When we pay attention to stablecoins, does this look okay for you guys? This is from the BIS. So when we pay attention to stablecoins, essentially what they are is they're digital versions of money. But they are designed to stay very stable to something like the dollar, right? They try to stay at about $1 range. What stablecoins did was they proved something very fundamental. They proved that money can be programmable, that it can move instantly without waiting days for banks to kind of clear those transactions. So your question should probably be, well, why aren't banks using stablecoins? Well, we know that stablecoins are issued from private companies like Circle, like Tether, like PayPal, like Ripple. But the banks are looking into tokenized deposits. That's what they're looking into. They are simply looking into tokenized deposits. Well, why would that be? Well, I don't believe that it's an ideological problem. I think that it's a practical issue for the banks. And in the UK, the tokenized deposits are probably the biggest. They're bigger than stablecoins in the UK, I believe. This is what they're really paying attention to. But you got to understand from the bank's perspective, well, what do the banks care about, right? The banks care about accounting. They care about regulations. They care about balance sheets. All of these things. This is what they care about. So stablecoins they essentially live outside of the banking system, right? They don't natively have a way to plug into the banking system. That's why you see these stablecoins, they're issued on all these different blockchain rails, right? The stablecoins have to be issued on different blockchain rails, but they don't natively plug into the traditional financial rails, right? They're issued by a private company, and regulators, and I think that that's kind of a concern for banks, that they're issued from a private company. The banks want the money. They don't want it to go to a private company. The banks want the fucking money, right? They want to know who controls it. How is it going to be recorded? What happens if something breaks? This is what they're paying attention to. The banks want the money. They don't want it to go to the private institutions. So they focus on tokenized deposits. And tokenized deposits are nothing new, guys. It's essentially the same money that is already in the banks, right? It's your checking account, your savings account, your business account. That money that is deposited into the bank, that money's already there. They just represent that into a digital form, into a tokenized form, right? And that money's probably 100 trillion, hundreds of trillions, probably tokenized deposits, probably hundreds of trillions of dollars. The banks, they already trust those deposits, right? The regulators understand the deposits. This is how the financial system has been working, I don't know, for the last 100 years. Customers use those deposits every single day. So what they realize is upgrading those deposits, they remove friction, right? And tokenized deposits should really be talked about alongside stablecoins because they really are a major focus. And it's not necessarily a rejection of the stablecoins because stablecoins have their place. They still play a role. But we're watching the large banks and institutions, they're choosing tokenized deposits over stablecoins. Of course, stablecoins are growing. I'm not saying that they're not. But they're choosing tokenized deposits because they can work inside of the existing system. That's why. So that's what we need to pay attention to, right? What solution works inside of the system that already exists? And we know at the heart of every financial infrastructure out there, the center of that is liquidity. Yes or no? Liquidity is how easily money can move and when it needs to move. What is friction in the context of banks? The friction within the context of banks would be the reconciliation time, the delays. It would be the over-collateralization, right? The nostro vostro, the freeing up the liquidity. There are friction points within our current financial system. That's why they're upgrading to tokenized deposits, because tokenized deposits is easing up on that freeing of those friction points. That's essentially, that's when I say friction, I'm talking about the current financial system. What are the issues that they're experiencing with the current financial system, and what does stablecoins or what does tokenized deposits ease up? Hopefully that answered your question. But in terms of the liquidity, right? Liquidity is essentially a tool, right? And money is already digital, guys. It's already digital, right? It's a bunch of ones and zeros on a computer. When you look at the debt, that's not money printed. That's probably all ones and zeros on a computer. But even though that money is digital, the way that it moves, it's still very slow and inefficient. And I don't believe that the average retail person sees this. They don't see it because it's all happening behind the curtain. When I send you a payment to your bank, or I Cash App you or Zelle you or Venmo you, you may see that instantly, right? It may look like those payments move instantly on your screen or on the surface. But behind the scene, that's not really how it works, right? The money waits. There's money that sits idle. There's money that's locked up. It's capital that's locked up. And then add on top of that the reconciliation between different systems. That makes it last fucking days sometimes before that money actually settles from my account to your account. The reconciliation, the waiting, the delay is a big problem as well. Freeing up the capital is a big problem, but we don't have that atomic settlement, that instant settlement. We don't have that right now. When that money has to wait 2 days, 3 days before it settles, when it's not being used, you're talking about trillions of dollars globally, all across the global banking system that's locked up. That is a major inefficiency. And tokenized deposits change that, right? Over $100 trillion in tokenized deposits. That money exists. It's already there. It's liquid. It's trusted. It's already regulated. But the issue is with the deposits is how the money moves, right? So the tokenized deposits are allowing these banks to move money faster, more efficiently, and they could do it in a programmable, controllable way. And from a bank's perspective, this is going to reduce the amount of money that they need to park just in case, right? The nostrovashos that we hear about all the time. The nostrovashos is 170 trillion. It's probably worth even more than that by now. But when you can free up that capital, that's one of the most important things that a bank can do. That liquidity doesn't just magically appear, right? That liquidity has to get locked, and when that liquidity is locked, you have an inefficiency in the system. The banks are losing out on money. When you can unlock that, you unlock efficiency within our financial system. So that's why the banks want to look into tokenized deposits. It's reducing the risk, it frees up locked capital, and it improves the settlement time. Tokenized deposits just happen to do all three of those. And one of the great things about it is it's not a new form of technology. It's what's already exists in the financial system. They don't need to change any of their internal systems. They don't have to introduce any new risks, right? Institutions don't think about money the same way that retail or customers do. They just don't. I'm telling you right now, and this has happened in every industry all over the world, the liquidity is going to flow wherever the friction is reduced. Whatever is convenient, whatever solves the problem, whatever works, that's where the money always flows. So the institutions are taking tokenized deposits very seriously. Now, I think that we need to go into another conversation, which would essentially be the difference between messaging and settlement, right? The difference between telling money to move and the money actually moving. So the global system has been built on top of messages. And ISO 222 absolutely upgraded that. It was transformative to the global financial messaging system all over the world, right? The banks are going to send the message, and then the settlement is going to happen later. And the money may feel fast, but the settlement in reality is really slow, right? The messages move much quicker than the settlement does. So you may see on your in your bank account that you received the $100 that I sent you, but your bank actually didn't receive that money. It's actually just like a promise or an IOU. It's the system's almost kind of built on like trust, right? Trustworthiness. Well, that 2 to 3 days between the settlement, that introduces risk. You have about 2 to 3 days of risk. And somebody has to trust that that money is going to arrive. They have to trust that that money is going to arrive. That's essentially where you get your custodians, right? Your custodians are kind of your middlemen for that kind of things. Well, the tokenized deposits change that trust. And they change it because they introduce that almost near instant settlement. And that's a big shift. So this is why the banks really care about it. Instead of the trust me, bro, I'll pay you later, the system moves to here's your money. It's already settled. Go buy your matcha. You already have the money. So less uncertainty means that there's less risk. If we know that the payment settles instantly, I don't need to worry 2 to 3 days whether or not I'm going to get the money. So that faster settlement reduces the risk. And less risk means that there's less parked idle capital, stagnant money. So regulators care about settlement and finality. This is why the banks are experimenting with tokenized deposits, because they're preparing themselves for a better settlement future. Okay? Now I need to add on top of that custody, because custodians are very important for settlement as well, right? If the banks are the pipes, then the custodians are essentially the vaults, right? Custodians are there to protect and account for the assets, essentially, right? Custodians, they protect things between like pensions and government funds and institutional money, even like securities. This is what they're protecting, right? It's trillions of dollars as well, hundreds of trillions of dollars, right? They don't risk that type of shit. There's no risk. They're not experimenting recklessly. There's no risk. They don't introduce any new risk. So a massive portion of the global financial system runs through a very small amount of custodians, right? There's only like a handful of them that are trustworthy enough to handle liquidity at scale, right? They hold trillions of dollars of they're balancing trillions of dollars every single day. You know, it's really a big job to have. And when you have these custodians and they're upgrading, it's another signal to you guys that we're shifting into a different era, right? You have these custodians, they are expanding their means for programmable money, tokenized deposits. They're preparing for a future where cash is programmable and interoperable with different systems, right? Your traditional legacy financial systems with your fintechs, your new money, right? So they're expanding their tokenized deposits. They're not piloting it. They're deploying it. They're upgrading the system. So let's talk about Ripple. We got to talk about Ripple, right? Institutions don't care about Ripple the same way that retail cares about Ripple, right? People think that retail thinks that Ripple is here to prop up the price of XRP, and it's like they're the a stock and the company to the stock, but that's not how institutions are viewing it. The institutions are viewing this solution as a way to see if it fits inside of institutional workflows. So you have Ripple Prime. Ripple Prime is not for retail. It's not. It's for institutions that are managing a large amount of balances, and they have to do it under very strict and very compliant rules. Okay? It used to be Hidden Road. They changed it to Ripple. Look at this. $3 trillion annually they're clearing. 300 institutional customers. They have an SOC Type 2 compliance. This is a big deal. Ripple Prime sits between traditional finance and digital rails, right? essentially what they're doing for these institutions is they're kind of like coordinating their cash management, their settlement, and the way that the assets are actually moving. And they're doing it through compliant rails. So it gives institutions a layer of control over their money. And here we go. We have Ripple positioning themselves inside of the system, not outside of it. Take a look at what BNY Mellon did. Enabled its tokenized deposits with Ripple Prime as an early adopter. What is this telling you? What is this telling you? The banks are not using coins. They're not buying coins hoping that it's going to go up. They're not. That's like a myth. That's a retail mindset. What the institutions care about is functionality, right? So you have assets like XRP, XLM, XDC, HBAR. All of these, they all solve a different problem. All of them, they all solve different problems. XRP helps money move across different systems cheaper, faster, right? Quant connects different systems. Stellar, they have digital representation of assets, right, as well as movement of money. Hedera, they're really focused on trust, compliance, and enterprise ready. Very predictable, very scalable, really built on trust, enterprise focused. But none of those are competitors. None of them. They're just different tools inside of the same system. And at some point, you start to realize that they all start to line up with one another, right? It's not competition, but we're converging, right? Fintechs and traditional finance is converging together. When you look at regulation, money, infrastructure, and institutions, all of them are moving in a particular direction. They're all moving together. Not randomly moving. It's telling you that the system is being prepared to be upgraded. Carefully. Carefully upgraded. When that happens, it's over. It's over. Every financial shift, it has always come down to the rails. The rails. Not the price. The price reacts last. The infrastructure is going to lead it. Not every asset is going to survive. Here's something that I don't know if I've ever told you, if I've ever really kind of put it together, but utility needs permission. Utility needs permission to participate. Why don't they buy coins if they can make money? Because they're not viewing it as an investment vehicle. They're viewing it as infrastructure, as a means to move money efficiently, as a means to secure data, as a means to implement programmable contracts. They're not viewing they don't view blockchain the same way that retail does. We're viewing it as an investment vehicle, but they're viewing this as infrastructure, right? These are assets that solve a real world problem. I have no need for cross-border payments. But you better believe JP Morgan, who moves $7 trillion a day, yeah, they probably have a need for cross-border payments. So if they have a technology that eases that friction point for them, and they can do it faster, cheaper, more efficiently, then that's what's going to survive. But utility needs permission to participate in the system. That's why we focus on compliance and regulations. You can have an asset that solves a real-world problem, but if it doesn't have permission to function inside of the financial system, it will never be used. It will never participate in the financial system. Utility needs permission to participate. That's why we talk about this being a filter. We talk about this being a filter because not every crypto is going to get that. Right? Not every crypto is able to be placed alongside institutions and banks and to function on that institutional scale. So it's another filter. It's another checklist that has to be paid off. when you compare utility assets to speculation, speculation exists everywhere, right? But utility only exists where the system allows it to exist. The system is being built. And the people who understand now that not every asset is going to survive, they're not going to be surprised later when every asset doesn't survive. So that's the difference between understanding what's happening and reacting to the short-term price action. That is your difference between utility and speculation. There's no other way to put it. Grown men are going to cry. They're going to cry. I would honestly make the argument that if you have been learning about crypto for the last year and you're paying attention to utility and regulations, you probably understand more about where this market is going than some people who have been in here since 2017 who are still focused on the meme narratives and the hype and the speculation. You probably have a better understanding of where this market is going. How to determine which asset has this permission. It comes down to compliance and regulations. So, and there's always a big checklist, right? Another one would be the MiCA regulations. So this is a framework regulating crypto assets. If they can comply with this, then they can be implemented in the financial system. If they can't, they get pushed outside of it. So let's look at USDT. Tether. Oh, look at that. Tether is not compliant in the MiCA regulation. So what does that mean? Is USDT available on public exchanges in the EU? No, it's unavailable due to MiCA regulations, forced outside of the system. That's what that means. If you cannot comply with the system, you will get pushed outside of the system. And that applies to this. It applies to the crypto asset regulations. It applies to the Genius Act, the US's stablecoin, right? You're going to have assets that comply, assets that don't. What happens when they don't comply? The Stable Act, the Genius Act. What the fuck am I thinking? Here is another one in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, the Genius Act, which we are waiting for them to pass, which is the first federal framework for regulated payment not stable coins. It's essentially the difference between, it's going to regulate whether something's a security or a commodity.